Sansa Stark had never seen the Sept of Baelor so crowded, nor so quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the stone floor. She stood near the front, her hands tightly folded, her heart racing. She had begged Joffrey, her sweet prince, to show mercy. She believed he had listened. After all, he smiled when she cried in his arms last night, whispering that everything would be fine if her father confessed, and Ned Stark had confessed. He had stood before the crowd, his voice shaking but clear, admitting to treason he never committed. Sansa had watched him, tears in her eyes, as he said he had betrayed the crown and tried to take the throne from Joffrey. It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true, but it didn't matter. He had said what needed to be said to live, the crowd murmured. Some cursed, some cheered. Sansa kept looking at her father, hoping, praying, that Joffrey would show the mercy he promised. King Joffrey Baratheon sat proudly on the platform, his crown slightly tilted, lips curled in a satisfied smirk. Beside him stood Cersei, looking pale but composed, her hand tightly gripping the arm of her throne. Next to her, Varys shifted uneasily, while Grand Maester Pycelle looked bored, as if he were waiting for dinner. Lord Baelish watched everything with his usual sly smile. Then Joffrey stood. He raised his hand. Sansa's heart soared. He was going to pardon her father. She clutched her chest, feeling hope burn bright in her chest, but his next words turned that hope into ice. "My mother and my council may beg for mercy," Joffrey said loudly, his voice clear over the square. "But traitors must die." Sansa's lips parted. She didn't understand. Her eyes flicked from Joffrey to her father, then back again. "He confessed his crime," Joffrey continued. "He tried to steal my crown. Let his death be a lesson to all who would do the same." Sansa took a step forward. "No!" she screamed. The crowd turned to look at her. Cersei stood up, alarmed. "Joffrey, you said, 'I am the king,'" he snapped. The executioner, Sir Elend Payne, stepped forward. Ned Stark was forced to his knees. His eyes searched the crowd until they landed on Sansa. She was crying, shaking her head. "Please," she mouthed, falling to her knees. Her father gave her a small smile, his lips trembling. He mouthed something back, "It's not your fault," and then the sword came down, right in front of her. The crowd gasped. Some screamed, others laughed. Blood splashed across the stone, and Sansa's scream pierced the sky like a blade. She collapsed to the floor, unable to breathe, unable to move. Her father's head rolled forward. His body slumped, and everything around her seemed to fade into nothing. Joffrey turned to her, as if expecting praise. "You see," he said proudly, "now he's gone. No more lies." Sansa looked up at him with hollow eyes. That was the moment something broke inside her, something that could never be fixed. The little bird died that day, and something darker was born. The blood didn't wash away. No matter how many times Sansa scrubbed her hands, it stayed there. In her mind, in her dreams, on her skin. She would close her eyes at night and see her father's head falling, his eyes still open, still looking at her. She heard his voice, soft, forgiving, right before the sword took everything from her. They kept her in her chambers after that. Not out of kindness, not out of grief, but because she had become unpredictable. She didn't cry anymore, not like before. She sat by the window for hours, staring at the Sept. Sometimes she mumbled to herself. The servants whispered that she had lost her mind. Maybe she had. But one thing remained sharp in her. Thoughts, Joffrey. He had promised mercy, he had smiled, and said she was his lady-love. He had let her father die in front of her, like it was nothing. The day after the execution, he came to her chamber, proud and cheerful, like a boy who had won a game. He brought her a rose and expected her to smile. Sansa had stared at it for a long time, then thrown it out the window. He laughed. "You're dramatic," he said, touching her face. "But you'll learn." She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice seemed to have disappeared somewhere between the moment her father knelt and the sword fell. Joffrey didn't care. He just liked the way she looked when she was quiet. "You'll marry me soon," he told her one evening, twirling a strand of her hair between his fingers. "And you'll forget all about your traitor father." She had almost spat in his face, almost. But Sansa Stark had learned something that day in the Sept. She learned what happened when you believed in love and honor and kings with pretty eyes. She learned that tears were useless, that mercy was a lie, and that the only way to survive in King's Landing was to smile, and so she did. The next morning, she wore the softest blue dress she owned, the one that made her look like a doll. She greeted Joffrey with lowered lashes and called him my king. She kissed his cheek when he handed her flowers and even blushed on command when he whispered crude things. In her ear, the court believed she had forgiven him, Cersei, believed she had accepted her new place, but deep inside her chest, behind her calm mask and empty eyes, Sansa was planning. One night, she snuck to the balcony of her chambers. From there, she could see the spot where her father had died. The stone was still stained, no matter how many times they washed it. She stood there for a long time, the wind brushing her hair, thinking about what her father would have said if he could see her now. Would he be ashamed of her? Would he understand? She didn't know, but she did know one thing. She would never forget, never forgive. That winter night, as the moon rose over the Red Keep, Sansa Stark made a silent vow. Joffrey would die, and it wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be clean. It would be slow, painful, public, just like her father. She would smile when it happened. She would look him in the eyes the way he had looked at her, with cruel pride. And when it was over, she would still be smiling, but that day was far away. For now, she was still the little bird in the golden cage, still the lady at his side, still the broken girl in the tower, except she wasn't broken. She was waiting, watching, listening. She started learning who the real players were in court. Littlefinger, always lurking with his empty compliments and snake eyes. Varys, soft-spoken and clever. Cersei, drunk more often now, muttering about ghosts and mistakes. Sansa kept her ears open, her eyes wider. She listened at doorways, made the handmaids talk when they thought she wasn't listening. Every kindness she received, she remembered. Every cruelty she recorded, and all the while, Joffrey grew more reckless, more arrogant. He beat her once in front of the court just to show he could. The bruise lasted days. The memory would last forever. You'll learn to love me, he said. She smiled even with blood on her lip. I already do. He believed her, because he wanted to, because he was a fool, but she wasn't, not anymore. The seasons began to turn. The heat of King's Landing grew heavier, but Sansa felt nothing. Her body still moved, still dressed in silks, still sat beside Joffrey during feasts and ceremonies. But her heart was far away, trapped in the cold of Winterfell, frozen beside her father's grave that never came. Sometimes she wondered if she had died with him that day, but every time Joffrey grabbed her wrist too tightly, every time he paraded her before the court like a trophy, every time he whispered poison in her ear, she remembered she was still alive, and so was her hatred. It burned hotter than wildfire. One evening, Joffrey decided to show off in front of the court. He had a man dragged into the throne room, a bard accused of singing a song, mocking the king. The man begged for his life, sobbing on his knees. Joffrey laughed and looked at Sansa. "Should I spare him, my lady?" he asked mockingly. The room chuckled. Everyone knew it was a game. Sansa looked at the bard, then at Joffrey. She smiled gently and said, "A traitor deserves no mercy, your grace." The bard was executed within moments. The crowd clapped. Joffrey beamed at her like she was a prize. But when no one was looking, Sansa turned her eyes to the floor and swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She hated herself for saying it, hated that she was starting to sound like them. But she had learned the rules. In this city, weakness got you killed. Soft hearts were crushed beneath golden crowns, so she hardened herself. She became what they wanted to see, but deep down, she was still that girl screaming at the Sept, watching her father's head fall. The worst part was the dreams. They came often now. Sometimes she saw her father sitting beside her, brushing her hair like he used to. But when she turned to speak to him, he would vanish, and in his place would be Joffrey, holding ice, her father's greatsword, dripping with blood. Other nights, she dreamed of the Sept again. But instead of her father on his knees, it was her. And Joffrey smiled as he gave the order. She'd wake up shaking, gripping her sheet so hard her nails dug into her palms. She wouldn't scream. She never screamed. Not anymore. She just got up, washed her face, and smiled like a queen. One afternoon, as she walked the gardens under heavy guard, a shadow fell across the path. It was Sandor Clegane, the Hound. He was always near, always watching her. He had been there at the Sept too. He didn't speak to her much, but he never laughed when Joffrey did. Never joined in when the boy king played his cruel games. He looked at her now with his dark, tired eyes. "You keep smiling like that, girl," he muttered. "You're going to forget how to cry." She paused. "Good," she said softly. "Crying doesn't bring the dead back." The Hound tilted his head, studying her like he wasn't sure what she was becoming. "That boy's not a king," he said under his breath. "He's a monster wearing a crown." Sansa looked straight ahead. "Monsters rule the world now." She walked on, her steps light, her back straight, but that moment stayed with her because someone had spoken the truth. And because, for the first time in a long time, someone saw the mask slipping. Later that week, she saw Tyrion Lannister for the first time since the execution. He was returning from the battlefield, battered and limping, but his mind was sharp as ever. He looked at her with a kind of sympathy that made her uncomfortable. "You look older, Lady Stark," he said. "King's Landing tends to do that." "I smile more," she replied politely. "And mean it less," he added. She blinked, then gave him a proper curtsy. "I serve the king," she said in a calm, practiced voice. Tyrion narrowed his eyes. "Yes, that's what worries me." That night she sat alone on the balcony again. Below her the Sept still stood tall, silent and cold like a tombstone. She watched the lights of the city flicker. Somewhere a child cried. Somewhere else a man screamed. King's Landing never slept, and neither did her vengeance. She didn't know when it would come, or how. But she had patience now. Patience and a mask made of courtesy and smiles. She would be Joffrey's lady for now. She would play the game, but she would remember her father. She would remember every slap, every insult, every cruel laugh. And one day, when no one expected it, the little bird would open her wings and fly straight for the king's throat. Autumn crept into King's Landing like a quiet curse. The heat faded, but the city still stank of rot, of spoiled fruit, sweat, and something worse that lingered in alleyways no one dared clean. From her tower window, Sansa watched the brown leaves swirl in the courtyard below. They reminded her of Winterfell, of the Godswood, of a world that felt like a dream now, so distant, so pure, it might have never existed. In King's Landing, purity was weakness, and weakness got you killed. The court was more restless these days. Whispers filled the halls, whispers of war, of Robb Stark's victories in the Riverlands, of the young wolf tearing through the Lannister armies with a fury none had expected. Every time the small folk chanted her brother's name, Sansa felt a strange ache in her chest. Not just hope, something fiercer, pride. She imagined Robb marching on the capital, kicking in the gates, dragging Joffrey down from the Iron Throne. But that was only a fantasy. Reality was crueler. Joffrey was still king, still alive, and more dangerous than ever. Since her father's execution, he had grown bolder in his cruelty. He had Sansa beaten for the smallest things now, a misplaced curtsy, a glance he didn't like. Once he had Sir Meryn slap her across the face in front of the court just because she corrected him on a family name. Her cheeks swelled for days. Cersei didn't stop it. Nobody did. The Queen only looked away, her mouth tight, her wine glass full. But Tyrion saw. When he returned from the war front and took his seat as Hand of the King, things began to shift, quietly, carefully. Tyrion was no hero, but he wasn't a monster either, and he had eyes that saw more than most. One morning, as Joffrey was forcing Sansa to watch two starving dogs tear apart a rabbit for sport, Tyrion stepped between them. "This is your idea of entertainment?" he said flatly. Joffrey grinned. "I'm showing her what happens to traitors." Tyrion's eyes flicked to Sansa. Her face was stone. Her hands were folded neatly. Only her knuckles were white. "I see," Tyrion said calmly. And is she the traitor or the rabbit? Joffrey shrugged. Whichever makes her cry. Tyrion didn't say anything else. He just turned, looked at Sansa and nodded slightly. That night a servant brought her a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a salve for her bruises. No note. Just that. It was the first kind gesture she'd received since her father died. She didn't trust it. But she didn't throw it away either. A few weeks later, word arrived that Stannis Baratheon was gathering ships. The court panicked. Soldiers came and went. Plans were whispered in dark corners. The city braced for siege. Sansa listened to everything, every secret fear, every mistake. Even Joffrey seemed nervous, though he hid it behind louder threats and sharper punishments. One day, he demanded that all the city's blacksmiths forge hundreds of crossbows. Another day, he insisted on visiting the battlements in gold armor, even though the fight hadn't begun. Sansa stood behind him as he barked orders to soldiers who had fought more battles than he had years. She saw how they looked at him, disgust masked by obedience. Even the Hound looked like he might push the boy off the wall if no one was watching. But Sansa, she smiled. "My king is so brave," she said sweetly. Joffrey puffed up, pleased. "I'll kill Stannis myself," he boasted. Sansa lowered her eyes. "Of course you will." When he stormed off, the Hound stayed behind. He leaned close and muttered, "You have a sharp tongue for a bird with clipped wings." She didn't reply, just looked out at the sea where Stannis' ships would soon arrive. "Tell me, Sandor," she asked quietly, "do monsters die the same as men?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "A sword don't care who it kills." That night, she dreamed of ice again, not lying in the dust at the Sept, but in her hands. She dreamed of walking into the throne room, holding it high, Joffrey kneeling before her, not out of love, but fear. She woke up sweating, but smiling. The days crawled forward. War was near. The court shifted like a snake, preparing to shed its skin. Sansa knew something else now. Chaos was coming, and in chaos, kings could fall. The drums of war began to thunder louder each day. By now, the city stank of fear. Walls were fortified, stockpiles of food were locked away, and the small folk whispered that death was coming from the sea. Sansa listened to the silence that followed those whispers, the kind that comes when hope runs out. Stannis Baratheon's fleet had been spotted off the Blackwater. The battle was no longer a rumor. It was coming like a storm, and the Red Keep braced itself like a ship preparing to sink. Sansa was moved into Maegor's holdfast with the other high-born women. Cersei was there too, draped in black, drinking more than ever, bitterness dripping from every word. Even her smug mask had begun to crack. "You think a queen is safe in war?" she said one night, pacing the room, cup in hand. "If Stannis wins, we'll all be raped and butchered before sunrise." "Even you, little dove." Sansa didn't answer. She just sat by the window, hands clasped, eyes on the sea. The others wept or whispered prayers to the Seven, but she was done praying. The gods had watched her father die. The gods had done nothing, and now the gods would watch. Joffrey bleed. She only hoped she'd be there to see it. The bells rang the next morning. Loud, heavy, final. The battle had begun. From the windows, she could hear screams in the distance, the roar of wildfire, the crackle of flames. She closed her eyes and pictured the city burning, the gates broken, the Red Keep crawling with soldiers who didn't wear Lannister red. Joffrey had gone to the battlements. Armed in golden armor he had no idea how to use. Sansa wondered if he thought he looked brave. She knew better. His hands trembled every time a real soldier got too close. The armor didn't make him a lion. It only made him easier to see. But still she waited. Hours passed. Then suddenly footsteps echoed in the holdfast. The doors burst open. Joffrey came in first, his golden armor smudged but still gleaming. His face was red, not from battle but from rage. "I had to come back," he shouted to his mother. "The hand said the king's place is in safety." Cersei didn't speak. She grabbed him by the arm and dragged him deeper into the chambers, like a frightened hen hiding its chick. Sansa watched it all with a strange numbness. The king had abandoned the fight. The city was burning. The walls might fall, And this was who they called king. She turned to the window again. Somewhere beyond those flames, men were dying. Somewhere her brother was fighting his own war. But in here, the so-called Lion of House Lannister had tucked his tail between his legs. Sansa didn't smile. Not yet. But her eyes held something cold and calm. Later, Cersei called her privately to her solar. The queen was drunk, her cheeks flushed, her eyes unfocused. She poured 2 cups of wine and handed one to Sansa. "This city will eat you alive," she said quietly. "They cheer for you now. But the moment you slip, they'll tear you apart." Sansa didn't touch the cup. "Then I won't slip." Cersei stared at her for a long time. "You sound like me when I was your age," she muttered, so full of pride. "So sure you could win?" "I'm not trying to win," Sansa replied. "Just survive." The queen chuckled darkly. "That's the same thing." As night fell, the battle raged on. The screams were louder now. Fires danced in the windows. Women clutched each other. Children cried. Even the scepter looked pale, and then, just before dawn, the bells rang again. But this time it was a victory bell. The Lannisters had won. Tyrion had led the defense. Lord Tywin had arrived with reinforcements. Stannis had been driven back. The city had been saved. Sansa watched as Cersei's face shifted back to arrogance, her fear washing away like dirt in wine. Joffrey paraded through the throne room that afternoon, wearing a smug smile, as if he had struck the final blow himself. He named Tywin the savior of the city, gave Tyrion nothing, and strutted to his throne like a dog who thought himself a lion. Sansa stood silently behind him as he addressed the court. "We are safe," he declared. "The traitors are broken. The king stands strong," the crowd cheered. Lords bowed. Ladies smiled. But Sansa just looked at him, not with love, not even with fear, but with a cold knowing. He hadn't saved the city. He hadn't fought the battle. And deep inside, she knew. He was still afraid. And fear was a weakness, one she would learn to use. The war outside the city walls had ended, for now, but Sansa Stark's war was far from over. The Blackwater had given Joffrey a crown, soaked in blood he didn't earn. And now he wore it heavier than ever, like a boy playing king in his mother's clothes. With victory came celebrations, feasts, boasts, rewards. Sansa was not rewarded. She was forgotten, or so they thought. Joffrey had a new prize now. Margaery Tyrell. She had arrived in King's Landing with her grandmother, the sharp-tongued Lady Olenna, both dressed in silk smiles and veiled intentions. Cersei hated them immediately. But Joffrey, he was enchanted. Suddenly, Sansa was no longer the future queen. She was just the girl whose father had died a traitor, a piece of the past no one wanted to remember. But that suited her just fine. The day the betrothal was broken, Joffrey announced it in court like he was tossing away old clothes. "Lady Sansa will, of course, be well taken care of," he said casually, "but I must do what's best for the realm." Sansa curtsied deeply. "Of course, Your Grace. I only wish for your happiness." The words tasted like ash on her tongue, but they worked. The court saw a loyal girl, a soft-spoken lady, a harmless bird with clipped wings. No one saw the knife she was slowly sharpening inside her heart. Lady Olenna did. Though, a few days after the broken betrothal, Sansa was invited to tea with the Queen of Thorns. It was supposed to be an innocent conversation, but Olenna didn't believe in innocence. "He's a monster, isn't he?" Olenna said plainly as she stirred her tea. Sansa blinked, unsure if it was a trap. Olenna rolled her eyes. "Don't look so surprised, child. I'm not blind. I see how he treats you. The bruises, the silences, the way your hands shake when his voice rises." Sansa lowered her gaze. "He's the king. Aye, and so was Aerys until someone roasted him alive." Sansa said nothing, but something stirred inside her. "Hope? No, not yet. But maybe. Possibility. I imagine you hate him," Olenna said. "Tell me true." "I won't hold it against you." Sansa looked up slowly. "More than I thought I could hate anyone." Olenna smiled. "Good. That's the beginning of wisdom." They didn't speak of it again. But from that moment, Sansa knew something important. She was not alone. There were others who saw what Joffrey really was. And one day, those people might be ready to act, but she couldn't count on anyone. Not yet. She still had to survive, and surviving meant enduring humiliation. Joffrey didn't let go easily. He may have chosen Margaery as his queen, but he still treated Sansa like a toy he'd lost interest in, but didn't want anyone else to have. He'd mock her during court, force her to attend his wedding's plans, make her stand beside Margaery as she tried on gowns, like a ghost at her own funeral. But Sansa smiled through it all, because now she saw the cracks forming in Joffrey's throne. Margaery was clever, far cleverer than Sansa had expected. She soothed Joffrey's temper, praised him, flattered him, but always kept a distance. She played the game better than Cersei did, maybe better than anyone, and Sansa watched her carefully, learning. She saw how Margaery slipped poison into kindness, how she whispered in Joffrey's ear and made him believe the words were his own, how she held the court's attention like a flame held moths, and most importantly, how she made Joffrey listen. Sansa realized something chilling one day as she watched them together. Margaery could survive him, but Sansa didn't want to survive Joffrey anymore. She wanted to outlive him. One night, as she sat alone in her chambers, looking out at the moonlight over Blackwater Bay, she whispered the words to herself, "I want to see him die." She didn't flinch when she said it, didn't feel guilt, only calm. Maybe that made her a monster too. But King's Landing had made her this way. This wasn't the little girl who dreamed of knights and princes. That girl had died at the Sept with her father. What was left was something colder, smarter, sharper. The next morning, Tyrion came to her chambers. She hadn't seen much of him lately, but his face was serious. His tone flat. "I'm sorry, Lady Stark," he said. "My nephew has decided you must marry me." The words hit her like a slap, but she didn't cry, didn't scream. She just said, "If it pleases the king." Tyrion looked at her, his face full of guilt. "It doesn't please me." Sansa met his eyes. "Nothing ever does." The wedding came swiftly, without joy and without music. Sansa stood in the godswood before a Septon who barely looked at her, her arms trembling under layers of silk. But not from fear, just anger, cold and deep, coiled tight in her stomach like a snake. Tyrion stood beside her, quiet and uncomfortable. She didn't hate him. He hadn't hurt her, but none of that mattered. This marriage wasn't hers. It was another chain, a new kind of prison, and Joffrey had the key. He attended the wedding, of course, sat smug on his throne, whispering cruel jokes into Margaery's ear. When it came time for Tyrion to cloak his bride, the stool wasn't there. Joffrey had it removed. Sansa stood there frozen as silence fell over the crowd, eyes on her, waiting to see how the dwarf would reach the shoulders of the tall, red-haired girl. Tyrion looked around, his face flushing, but he didn't beg, didn't plead. Instead, he turned to Joffrey and said, "Then she shall cloak me instead." There were a few forced laughs. Joffrey didn't find it funny, but Sansa, she saw something different in that moment. Not pity, not humiliation, defiance. And that mattered more than any crown. After the feast, Sansa was escorted to their chamber. She was prepared for the worst. Another man laying claim to her like she was land or coin. But Tyrion sat on the edge of the bed, poured himself wine, and said, "I won't touch you, not unless you want me to. And by the look on your face, that day may never come." Sansa turned away, but for the first time in a long while, her breath didn't shake. She fell asleep that night fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, thinking only of Joffrey, his smile, his voice. The way he had ordered her father's death without blinking, he wouldn't stop. Not until he destroyed every last piece of her, unless someone stopped him first. The next morning, she walked into the throne room with her new husband and held her head higher than she ever had before. She saw Joffrey's face twist with irritation, as if her composure offended him. He called her Lady Lannister in front of the court, smirking. But she didn't flinch. She curtsied deeply and replied, "May I serve House Lannister better than it served my own." For a moment silence, then quiet laughter. But Joffrey didn't smile, and that was a victory. The days passed slowly. Margaery continued to wrap her vines around Joffrey's neck, softening his edges in public, playing the perfect bride-to-be. But Sansa saw the cracks grow wider every day. Joffrey was impatient. He hated being managed, hated being second to anyone, even his own betrothed. And she also saw something else. Whispers in the hallways, servants who talked too quickly, meetings behind locked doors. Varys was always watching. Littlefinger was gone, then suddenly back. Something was shifting. The air tasted different. Then came the wedding, Joffrey's wedding. Sansa was dressed in grey, almost invisible among the golden gowns and bright silks of the Tyrells. She stood far in the back beside Tyrion, watching as Joffrey and Margaery exchanged vows beneath the eyes of hundreds. The crowd cheered. The bells rang. Doves flew, but Sansa felt nothing, only a quiet pulse of dread in her chest. The feast began. Endless food, wine, dancing. Joffrey demanded music, mockery, humiliation. He poured wine on Tyrion's head, laughed when Sansa flinched, forced a dwarf troop to reenact the War of the Five Kings. And all the while, he drank and drank and drank, until his face began to turn red, until his laughter became coughing, until his cough became choking. Silence fell across the hall, then chaos. Joffrey stumbled forward, hands clawing at his throat, his eyes bulging. Blood spilled from his mouth. He pointed to Tyrion with shaking fingers, but no words came. He collapsed, convulsed, and died, right there, in front of everyone, on his own wedding day. Sansa didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, but inside her chest, something bloomed. Not joy, no, not revenge. Either relief. The monster was dead, and the world had finally done something. Right, the screams were still echoing through the hall. When Sansa slipped away, while the court descended into chaos, while Cersei wailed over Joffrey's corpse and guards seized Tyrion by the throat, Sansa moved like a shadow behind the pillars, her heart steady, her hands calm. Ser Dontos waited where he said he would, reeking of wine, shaking with fear, but loyal for now. He led her through hidden doors, dark tunnels, and out of the Red Keep. She didn't look back. Not once. The bells of the city rang in mourning. Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king, the golden monster, was dead, poisoned at his own wedding, the lion choked by something he couldn't see. And for the first time, in what felt like years, Sansa Stark could breathe, but she didn't smile. Not yet. She didn't trust this freedom, not when she didn't earn it with her own hands. Joffrey was dead, yes, but not by her doing. And that gnawed at her, because she wanted to be the one. She had imagined it so many times. A dagger beneath his ribs, a whisper of Valyrian steel across his throat, watching the life leave his eyes the way she'd watched it leave her father's. But that moment wasn't hers. Still, she was free, and that had to mean something. The ship waited at Blackwater Bay. Littlefinger greeted her there, smug and smiling, cloaked in secrets. "My dear Sansa," he said, offering his hand like a gentleman, "you're safe now." She didn't take his hand, but she followed him anyway. What choice did she have? He brought her to the Vale, to her Aunt Lisa, to a new name, Elaine Stone, and a new cage, though this one had mountains instead of walls. Sansa learned quickly that Petyr Baelish was no savior. He was another man who wanted to use her. But he was smarter than Joffrey, softer, slipperier. He never raised his hand, but he pulled the strings. Every word he spoke was a trap dressed in silk. And so, Sansa gave him what he wanted: obedience, kindness, trust. She played the perfect bastard niece, smiled sweetly, learned the names of all the Vale lords, learned how to lie, and all the while, she remembered every lesson Joffrey taught her, every cruelty that made her strong, every scar she carried beneath her skin. One afternoon, she stood on the balcony of the Eyrie, wind tugging at her hair, eyes on the distant horizon. Petyr came to stand beside her. "I know what they did to you in King's Landing," he said softly. "And I know what you dream of." She said nothing. He leaned in closer. "You wanted him dead." Still she was silent. Then he whispered, "You should be grateful." She turned to him slowly, eyes unreadable. "I'll be grateful," she said. "When it's my hand that takes the next one. Littlefinger blinked, and in that moment, he finally saw it. Not the little bird, not the scared girl from Winterfell, but something older, colder, forged in fire and blood, Sansa Stark. He stepped back, just slightly, and smiled. She smiled too, but for different reasons. She had learned what power looked like. It wasn't Joffrey drunk on violence. It wasn't Cersei clinging to crowns. It wasn't even Petter Baelish with his web of lies. It was patience, the kind of patience that let you smile at the man who killed your father, the kind that let you wear a dress while sharpening a dagger beneath it, the kind that waited years for justice, even when it came dressed as tragedy. Sansa didn't know where the road ahead would take her. Winterfell was lost. Her family was scattered. The world was still full of wolves and lions and monsters, but she was no longer prey. She was something else now, something that knew how to survive, how to wait, how to win. Years later, when snow returned to the north and the wolves rose again, they would whisper her name with awe, not as the girl who watched her father die, not as the broken bird in the Red Keep, but as the woman who learned how to fly through fire and never forgot who lit the match. Sansa Stark, the last memory of the old world, the first lesson of the new.